this episode, we bring the planning threads together into a finished assessment plan that people can actually follow without arguing about what it means. Up to this point, you have seen how objectives, scope, resources, schedule, deliverables, logistics, and evidence assembly all fit into the same story. But a plan only becomes real when it is finalized and agreed to. Finalizing does not mean making it perfect, because real environments change, but it does mean locking in the key decisions so the assessment can move forward with clarity and rigor. Beginners sometimes imagine an assessment plan as a template you fill out to satisfy a checkbox. Yet the plan is really a communication tool that prevents misunderstandings and protects the credibility of the work. It should match requirements, meaning it traces to what you are assessing against, and it should match stakeholder needs, meaning it produces results that the right people can use to make decisions. When those two matches happen at the same time, the assessment becomes both defensible and useful instead of being busy work. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to think about requirements is that they define what must be true, while stakeholder needs define what must be understood and acted on. Requirements may come from laws, regulations, contracts, internal policies, or adopted frameworks, but regardless of the source, they create expectations that you cannot simply ignore because they are inconvenient. Stakeholder needs include things like timing, the level of detail required, the format of deliverables, and the level of confidence expected for decisions like authorization, risk acceptance, or remediation prioritization. The assessment plan is where these pressures meet, which is why finalizing it is more than administrative cleanup. If the plan overfocuses on requirements without considering stakeholder realities, it can demand evidence no one can produce in the available time, or it can disrupt business operations unnecessarily. If the plan overfocuses on stakeholder preferences without honoring requirements, it can produce a friendly report that fails to hold up under scrutiny. The goal is a plan that respects both, openly documents trade-offs, and sets expectations that will still make sense when the findings are challenged. A finalized plan needs a clear statement of assessment criteria, meaning exactly what you will measure the environment against. Criteria are not vague themes like strong security, but concrete expectations, such as a specific control set, a defined policy baseline, or a mapped list of requirements for the system. Beginners often assume criteria are obvious, but in real organizations, multiple standards can apply at once, and different stakeholders may assume different criteria without realizing it. One group might think you are assessing against internal policies, another might think you are assessing against a regulatory framework, and a third might think you are doing a readiness check for an external audit. If you do not finalize criteria explicitly, you can end up delivering a report that satisfies no one because it does not answer the question they thought you were asking. A strong plan lists the criteria clearly enough that someone reading it later can understand why a particular piece of evidence was relevant. This also supports repeatability, because future assessments can follow the same criteria and compare results meaningfully over time. The plan also needs a finalized scope statement that is specific enough to prevent scope creep while still being realistic about dependencies. Scope should define the system boundary, in-scope asset categories, in-scope processes, and any key exclusions, along with a rationale that ties back to objectives and criteria. A common mistake is to write scope so broadly that it sounds impressive, then quietly narrow it later when time runs out, which creates trust issues. Another mistake is to write scope so narrowly that you miss critical supporting services, especially identity, logging, and shared infrastructure. Finalizing scope means you have identified what you will directly assess, what you will assess indirectly, and what you will document as a limitation. It also means you agree on what environments are included, such as production, development, testing, or disaster recovery, because findings can change depending on where you look. When scope is finalized, stakeholders can prepare, and the assessment team can plan evidence requests with precision rather than repeatedly renegotiating boundaries midstream. Method selection is another area that needs to be explicit in a finalized plan, because methods influence both rigor and stakeholder comfort. Some stakeholders expect interviews and document review, while others expect technical testing, and sometimes those expectations conflict with operational constraints. The plan should state which methods will be used for which kinds of controls or requirements, and it should explain how evidence will be evaluated. If a control requires demonstration of operation, the plan should say how operation will be verified, such as reviewing records over a time period, observing system outputs, or validating configurations through permitted access. If a control is procedural, the plan should describe how procedure adherence will be validated beyond simply reading a document. Method clarity prevents a pattern where stakeholders provide only policy documents and then act surprised when the assessment asks for operational records. It also protects the assessment team from being pressured into lowering rigor because the plan becomes a reference point for what was agreed. A finalized plan does not have to be technical, but it must be clear enough that the methods can be applied consistently. Sampling decisions should also be finalized in the plan, because sampling is one of the most common reasons stakeholders question findings. If you review 10 change tickets and find issues, someone may argue that you should have reviewed 100, or they may argue that those 10 were not representative. A good plan defines populations, sample size approaches, and how samples will be selected, whether randomly, by risk category, or by time window. The plan should also describe how exceptions will be handled, such as expanding sampling if anomalies are found, or narrowing sampling if evidence quality is poor and time is limited. This is not about turning the assessment into a statistics exercise. It is about making the selection logic defensible and repeatable. When sampling is pre-decided and documented, stakeholders are less likely to interpret sampling as cherry-picking. It also helps the assessment team estimate effort more accurately because sampling size strongly affects workload. Finalizing sampling makes the assessment feel fair, which matters for cooperation and trust. Roles and responsibilities are another place where finalization matters because assessments require coordination and accountability. The plan should identify who leads the assessment, who provides access and evidence, who schedules interviews, and who approves scope changes. It should also clarify who owns the system and who owns remediation actions, because those are often different groups. Stakeholders sometimes assume assessors will chase down every document and resolve every access barrier, while assessors sometimes assume system owners will proactively supply everything without prompting. A finalized plan eliminates those assumptions by stating responsibilities and timelines for evidence submission and review. It also clarifies decision authority, such as who can accept limitations, who can authorize additional testing, and who signs off on the final report. When responsibilities are unclear, the assessment turns into delays and frustration that do not improve security. When responsibilities are clear, the assessment becomes a predictable process that respects everyone's time. A realistic schedule is part of the finalized plan, but what makes it realistic is that it reflects stakeholder availability and operational constraints rather than existing only on paper. The plan should include key milestones like kickoff, evidence collection windows, interview periods, testing windows if applicable, draft review periods, and final report delivery. It should also include mechanisms for schedule changes, such as how to request an adjustment and who approves it, because schedule changes are almost guaranteed. Another subtle schedule element is freeze and blackout windows, where systems cannot be touched or teams cannot engage, like end-of-quarter periods, major releases, or business peak seasons. A plan that ignores those realities will either fail or force workarounds that reduce evidence quality. Finalizing the schedule with stakeholder input is not a concession. It is how you preserve rigor by ensuring the right people and evidence are available at the right time. A schedule that everyone understands also reduces last-minute panic, which is when mistakes and misunderstandings multiply. Deliverables and reporting expectations must be finalized as well, because stakeholder needs often show up most strongly in what they expect to receive at the end. Some stakeholders want an executive summary with clear risk statements, while others need detailed findings with evidence references and actionable recommendations. The plan should define what deliverables will be produced, the level of detail, and who the intended audience is for each deliverable. It should also define review cycles, such as whether system owners will review factual accuracy before the report is finalized, and how disputes about wording or severity will be handled. This does not mean stakeholders get to edit away findings. It means the assessment team allows correction of factual errors while preserving independent judgment. A plan should also define how sensitive evidence will be handled in reporting, because some evidence cannot be embedded directly in reports due to security or privacy concerns. When deliverables are clear, the assessment produces useful outputs rather than surprising people with a format that does not meet their decision-making needs. Evidence management and logistics are often overlooked during finalization, yet they are part of what makes an assessment defensible. The plan should specify how evidence will be requested, transmitted, stored, and protected, and it should specify who has access to the evidence repository. It should also define how evidence will be labeled, tracked, and linked to findings, because traceability is a major part of defensibility. Logistics also include meeting formats, interview practices, and communication channels, including how urgent issues discovered during the assessment will be escalated. If a serious weakness is found, the plan should make clear whether it will be reported immediately, to whom, and through what channel, rather than waiting for the final report. Finalizing logistics also reduces friction for the assessed team because they know where to send things and what to expect. When evidence handling is planned, you also reduce the risk of evidence sprawl, where documents are scattered across email, shared drives, and personal notes. A centralized, controlled approach supports integrity and trust. One of the most important parts of finalizing an assessment plan is explicitly managing trade-offs, because requirements and stakeholder needs can pull in different directions. Stakeholders may want a fast turnaround, but the requirements may demand thorough evidence and validation. Stakeholders may want minimal disruption, but the requirements may demand operational proof that requires access and observation. The assessment plan is where you make these trade-offs visible, document them, and obtain agreement about what they mean for confidence in results. A realistic plan might state that certain areas will be assessed with limited depth due to time constraints, and that conclusions for those areas will be stated with appropriate caution. Alternatively, the plan might state that to meet the required level of confidence, additional resources or time are necessary. Either way, the plan prevents a later surprise where someone expects high-confidence conclusions from low-effort work. Finalization is essentially a moment of honesty that protects everyone: assessors, stakeholders, and the organization's decision-making process. A finalized plan should also include how quality will be maintained during the assessment, because consistency is part of rigor. This can include using standardized interview questions aligned to criteria, using consistent evidence evaluation rules, documenting evidence sources, and conducting internal reviews of findings before they are shared. Quality planning also includes handling disagreements professionally, because disagreements are normal when findings affect reputations or timelines. The plan can define how disputes are raised, what counts as a valid challenge, and how the assessment team will respond. This does not turn the assessment into a debate club. It turns it into a controlled process where both sides understand the rules. For beginners, it is useful to recognize that a plan is not only about work tasks. It is also about governance of the assessment itself. When the plan addresses quality and dispute handling, the assessment is less likely to be derailed by emotion or politics. By the time the assessment plan is finalized, it should read like a clear agreement that ties objectives to criteria, criteria to scope, scope to methods, methods to evidence, and evidence to deliverables, all within a schedule and resource reality that stakeholders accept. It should also handle logistics and evidence management in a way that protects integrity and reduces friction. Most importantly, it should produce outputs that stakeholders can use to make the decisions they actually need to make, while still honoring the requirements the organization is responsible for meeting. Finalizing the plan is a disciplined step that turns assessment work into something repeatable and defensible, rather than something improvised. When you learn to finalize plans this way, you are learning to operate in the governance space with professionalism, because you are building trust through clarity. That trust becomes the foundation for the next stage, where evidence is evaluated and findings are formed, and it is much easier to do that well when the plan matches both requirements and stakeholder needs.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.